Welcome to Medieval Grimspire Chronicles. You are not a knight, not a noble, not a servant with honest work and a quiet corner. You are the Jester, a painted distraction in a hall of silk and sharpened knives. Your bells announce you, so they always hear you coming. You're Motley, so they never forget what you are. You mock their enemies, their clergy, and sometimes, if you're feeling brave, you mock them, but never too hard, never too long. In this world, the line between amusement and offense is the width of a smile, and it grows even thinner when the wine runs out. You don't remember the moment they realized you were different, but someone does. It was when you wouldn't stop crying at the wrong time, or laughing at the right one, or how your limbs bent, or your voice cracked too early and too loud. Perhaps you were born with a twisted spine or a face that looked too knowing for a child. The adults began to look at you sideways, some with pity, some with fear. The worst looked at you with interest. You grew up in a forgettable village, a place that didn't appear on maps. Your family, if you could call them that, worked the land badly and drank away what little they earned. You slept near the hearth in the same itchy sack you were born in. Nobody talked about dreams. You didn't dream of escape. You barely dreamed at all. You learned early that people laughed when you spoke, not at what you said, but that you said it. You asked questions other children didn't. Why does the priest smell like wine? Why does the reeve have 3 pigs when we have none? Why does God only strike the poor with boils? The laughter that followed was sometimes fast and forced, cruel. At first, you mistook it for affection. Later, you knew better. The village idiot was old and drooled in the tavern corner. You thought you were nothing like him until one day you saw your reflection in a water basin and recognized that same strange twinkle in the eyes, the look of someone who notices too much and is punished for it. But you kept talking because silence felt like death. You made up songs. You mimicked the priest's lisp. You crossed your eyes and pretended to bless chickens. The villagers called you clever in the same tone they used for cursed. Then the man in the dark green cloak came. He rode a horse with shoes better than yours and didn't smell of dung or smoke. He was a steward or an envoy, something with a title no one understood. He watched you from the shadows as you performed your impression of the Miller arms, flailing, cheeks puffed, voice wheezing. You thought he wasn't looking. He was. The next day, you were told you were leaving. The woman who was your mother or aunt handed you a linen bundle and walked away before you could open it. Inside was a stiff heel of bread, a shirt that smelled of wet goats, and a wooden cup carved with someone else's initials. You rode in the back of a cart between crates of squawking poultry. The steward spoke about you to the driver. This one might be useful, not talented, not promising, just useful. The journey felt endless. You learned to chew slowly, so the driver wouldn't accuse you of eating too much. The chickens received more consistent attention. You arrived at the castle at dusk. It wasn't the grand fortress from minstrels' tales, but a squat, damp mass of stone, half-choked in ivy. The air smelled of wood ash, wet straw, and meat left out too long. No one greeted you. You were not precious cargo, not even curious cargo. You were led inside through corridors that smelled of boiled onion and old wool. Servants bustled past with glazed eyes. One bumped your shoulder without apology. Another glanced at you and muttered, "Is that it?" before vanishing. You were presented to a man at a desk stacked with slates. "Is this the one?" he asked. The steward shrugged. "He'll do." A scrap of parchment changed hands. "He's yours now," the man said, "until he isn't." You were given a bowl of grayish porridge and ate alone on an upturned bucket near the kitchen hearth. No one sat beside you. Someone coughed and turned away. You were given a space knot, a room, but an alcove beside a staircase, a lumpy mattress, an old wool blanket, a dented tin cup, a candle stub dripped wax on the stone. "Don't wander," the steward said. "Don't touch anything. And when you hear bells move," you nodded, though you didn't understand. You lay in the dark, listening to the castle breathe. Footsteps, creaking doors, distant laughter. This wasn't a home. It was a leftover space. You were an afterthought. The next evening, your uniform arrived. A lumpy bundle of wool, in a chaotic mess of colors, dumped on a bench without ceremony. It smelled of mildew, vinegar, and human anxiety. The wool was scratchy and stiff with old sweat. Bells were sewn into the hem-steiny brass, and incessant. They were not cheerful. They were a leash, a warning in miniature. You were not allowed to be quiet ever again. There was a hat, to a drooping thing with 3 floppy horns, the color of a sun-scabbed wound. A small, stained scrap of parchment fell from it. There was no writing, just a smear of dried blood, and the imprint of a thumbnail. You crumpled it and threw it into the hearth. Whatever message it held, it wasn't yours to carry. You dressed behind a rack of linens. The tunic was too tight at the armpits, too loose at the waist. The leggings were held together by hope more than thread. When you were fully dressed, it felt less like clothing and more like a skin you couldn't peel off. They gave you a stick, 2 feet of ashwood tipped with a stitched pig's bladder. You hit people with it, or they hit you, or you just wave it around while making an ass of yourself. You were told the first time you walked in costume, the bells felt like judgment. Servants glanced up, some smirked, others looked away, as if staring might be contagious. You caught your reflection in a polished metal tray hanging in a corridor. The figure staring back was a stranger caricature of yourself, a joke that walked. You tried to smile. The reflection's mouth twitched, but the eyes stayed still. The first time you were summoned to perform, it was, without warning, you were led into the great hall. Firelight spilled across rushes. The smell of greasy meat lingered. Someone groaned. Not him again. The man with the rings. The Lord slouched at the high table, a cup of red wine in his hand. He waved you forward with lazy fingers. You had no script. Your job was to be amusing, and what that meant changed with the wine, the meat, and the day's insults. You started with an impression of the Chamberlain pompous nasal, with a stammer that vanished when he was angry. You puffed out your chest and strutted, a few snorts of laughter. The clink of goblets encouraged. You mimicked the bishop's latest sermon, wobbling your knees and flapping your arms, declaring that God loves the nobility most because they taste less like onions when they die. That earned a laugh, not roaring, but enough. You learned quickly that being a fool had little to do with jokes. It was about timing, tone, and most of all, tension. Your job was to lift it when it threatened to crack the walls, or poke it just enough to release pressure without setting the place ablaze. Every noble had a grievance, too polite to shout and too proud to swallow. You were to say it for them sideways, dressed like a puppet, smiling as if you didn't understand your own words. Some nights you walked a tightrope made of silk and spite, and sometimes it frayed underfoot. You called a noble's hunting dog, the better air, and the room went deathly quiet. You froze, but then the noble chuckled just once, just enough, and the laughter returned like a flood. You bowed and left the joke unfinished. Everyone understood. No one said it aloud. They said you were protected, that fools had license to speak the truth. But you saw a kitchen boy dismissed for laughing at the wrong punchline. You heard whispers of a jester in another household who mimicked the wrong lord's limp and was strung from the rafters. Protection was a myth people used to make cruelty feel ceremonial. Your stick helped. The bladder gave a satisfying wobble when you thwacked your own head, and it made a farting sound when slapped against your hip. But you noticed it was shaped like a club. You wondered if it was for your defense or simply a reminder of your role. The laughter became addictive. You chased it, stretching a joke too long, milking a gag for an extra beat when it worked, felt a thrill when it didn't. The silence was cold and wet, like stepping barefoot into a midnight pond. There was the night with the haircut joke. You hadn't planned it. You glanced at a young noble with meticulously arranged golden curls, and the words tumbled out, a joke about a rooster, a wig maker, and a mirror that cracked in self-defense. A second of silence, then the young man snorted, clapped, and said, "He's not wrong." The laughter was loud and relieved. You grinned and bowed, but you knew you hadn't been jesting. The best jokes weren't fiction, they were truth, wearing bells. You saw the dangerous currents beneath the surface. One night, a noble woman laughed too hard at your joke, and her husband watched her like a butcher watching a clever pig. You saw her smile die. You stepped back, bowed, and changed the subject with a fart noise from your stick. The room's temperature reset. You were useful. You turned gossip into rhyme. You mocked the man no one else dared name. If he laughed, they laughed. If he didn't, they stared into their goblets and pretended not to know you. You were a pressure valve in Motley, keeping the cracks in the ceiling from spreading. Sometimes a noble would beckon you after a meal and ask you to repeat a joke, but you sensed he wasn't interested in laughter. He was testing you, testing whether the joke still had teeth or if you'd grown cautious. They always preferred a dangerous fool to a cautious one. Caution was for back rooms and midnight summons. Laughter, like wine, was best served strong and slightly poisoned. You began to notice how people looked at you, not just watching, but measuring. You were not a person to them. You were a mirror with a voice, and they waited to see what reflection you'd offer. The older nobles frightened you the most. They didn't laugh as easily. They'd survived too many changes in power. They watched you like chess players studying the board. You knew that if you ever stopped being useful, they'd sweep you aside without pause or pity. Sometimes a lady would slip you a scrap of meat, or a servant would whisper a safe joke about the baker's boldness or the bishop's gout. You collected these like charms, offerings to the gods of survival. You learned to wield silence itself, sometimes sitting by the hearth with a blank expression and a tilted head was funnier than any jest. It made them nervous. They filled the silence for you. You were always close to everything, hearing things you shouldn't, whispered insults, names mentioned in fear, laughter that died too quickly. You were not in these games. but you were always on the board. Sometimes you were asked to repeat what you'd seen, not directly, but with a casual question, a suggestion. You played dumb. Your refusal only confirmed their suspicion that you were smarter than you looked, that made you more interesting and more dangerous. A steward once pulled you aside. "The Lord liked your little song last night," he said. Then he leaned closer. "He liked it very much. You should be careful. What you like too much." You spent that night replaying every verse, wondering which line was the blade. There were games you weren't meant to understand, but you were expected to juggle them anyway. You mocked a visiting noble's accent. He laughed uproariously. 2 nights later, the cook told you his cousin was sent home with a broken nose and a severed purse string. "Too much laughing," she said with a shrug. You never joked about his accent again. Then came the dead mouse on your cot, its neck broken, a single feather tucked behind its ear, a message after a joke about falconers' birds being smarter than their handlers. You said nothing. You burned the mouse in the kitchen hearth. You started checking under your blanket before you slept, the weight built behind every laugh pressing against your ribs. It was the knowledge that you were a hinge on which other people's grudges turned. You could tilt the room with a smile, but if you tilted it wrong, you were the one who fell into the fire. You began to hear the phrase you dreaded most, always whispered, always in the past tense. He went too far. It finally happened after a feast. The bishop had returned. You'd been told to behave, no saints, no relics. You nodded and planned to stick to safe material. But midway through your routine, a noble shouted from the back, "Tell the one about St. Hubert and the goats." You froze. The joke wasn't yours. You'd only heard it once from a drunken squire who swore the bishop would find it hilarious. You hesitated. The room waited. You told it, watering it down, softening the ending. The bishop did not laugh. You were dismissed early. No applause, no eye contact. You bowed and left the hall without breathing. You made it to your cot before the pain came. You didn't see who hit you. You didn't hear the first blow. You woke hours, maybe days, later. Your jaw wouldn't close properly. Something hard and white rolled loose in your mouth, tooth, one near the front. You spat it into your hand and stared at it, small, pale, and useless. You didn't leave your mat for 2 days, maybe 3. No one visited, but someone left stale bread near your feet each morning, as if feeding a half-forgotten animal. When you could move again, a servant woke you before dawn. Your 2-pack. Bring the bells. The castle was evacuating. The plague had returned, or maybe it had never left. You were loaded onto a wagon with barrels of salted fish and a cage of hens. The bells on your costume jingled with every rut in the road. The driver threatened to cut them off with a knife. You believed him. The new manor was smaller, colder, perched on a hill where the wind howled. The hall smelled of mouse droppings and damp stones. You were told to perform as if nothing had changed. You made a joke about rats wearing masks. It got a few strange chuckles. Someone coughed. Someone else left the room. You pretended not to notice. There were fewer people now, fewer laughs, but still enough demand for entertainment. You were told to cheer up a dining hall where half the guests were absent and one of the remaining ones would only eat wine-soaked pears. You danced. You fell down. You told the same 3 jokes in different orders, hoping the wine had dulled their memory. It usually had war arrived with attics. The Lord sold furniture, then livestock, then loyalty. New banners hung in the hall, new guests with names you weren't meant to remember. You performed for men in armor who smelled of blood and horse piss. They clapped you on the back hard enough to bruise. One told you to mimic the enemy commander. When you hesitated, he gripped your shoulder and said, "We'll find another fool if you're not funny." You did the impression. You gave the commander a squeaky voice and a fondness for kissing horses. They laughed so loud you couldn't hear your own heartbeat. You attended funerals now, not as a mourner, but as a sideshow. You stood by in full motley, juggling soft apples, while the priest mumbled half-remembered psalms. You were the punctuation, distracting the living from how icily the dead disappeared. You lost another tooth. It just fell out into your hand while you drank. From a chipped cup, you tucked it into a crack in the wall behind your mat. It felt like rot that spreads faster when seen. You began to recognize the look nobles got when deciding whether to laugh. It wasn't joy, it was calculation. Their lives were shrinking. Your jokes didn't make them happy. They made them feel clever for understanding them. That was enough. You developed new material, shorter, sharper, less personal. No more jokes about marriages or bishops. Now it was bodily humor, barnyard comparisons, safer nonsense. You did a bit where you tripped over your own feet and blamed your cursed bells. They liked that. You did it 3 nights in a row. On the 4th, no one laughed, and someone threw a chicken leg. You caught it mid-air. They laughed at that. You didn't sleep well. The coughing came through the walls again. Someone in the kitchen died, and you were given their blanket. It was still warm. You wrapped it around your shoulders and didn't ask who it belonged to. The court wandered, fleeing plague and skirmishes, before finally returning home. The rats had reclaimed the larder. The tapestries hung stiff with mildew, but the castle was still standing. So were you. Barely. The great hall was quieter, thinner, but the routines resumed. Supper song, laughter, where it was expected. You were still the jester, still wearing the bells, still expected to fill the gaps in other people's grief with something resembling mirth. You returned each night to your corner, not a room, not a cell, just a drafty stone alcove near the kitchen door. A pile of old straw and a warped bench had learned your shape. Someone had left you a blanket once. The steward took it back for a visiting priest. Now you used your spare Motley as a cover. It smelled of mildew and dried sweat, but it was yours, at least until someone else needed it. You didn't go to the servants' quarters. They didn't want you there. It wasn't spoken, just understood. You were not one of them. You were not one of anyone. You were the jester-shaped hole in everyone's life, present but not touchable, familiar but not trusted. You'd been there 15 years by your count. You developed a talent for silence, how to step without creaking, how to breathe without stirring sleepers, how to move without casting a shadow that made guards flinch. You could clear a hallway just by walking down it. You learned to make yourself laugh quietly, mostly at nothing. A squeaky hinge, a pigeon landing sideways, a knight farting through a sermon. These were your private performances, moments that belonged only to you. There was a warped bronze mirror in a hallway. At night, when no one was awake, you sat before it and watched yourself. The motley looked even worse in the distorted metal bright. and lifeless, like someone had dressed a carcass. Your face was a smear of angles and shadows. One eye drooped, one tooth was missing. You'd stopped trying to smile in reflections. It felt like lying. One night, you looked at yourself and said, "You're not funny." The reflection nodded. You tilted your head. So did it. You said, "They'll forget me the second I fall down the stairs." The reflection's grin widened. You started talking to it most nights, little quips, observations. They gave the dog a name, but not me. Isn't that something? That Mira laughed softly, sadly, exactly the way you did. It became a ritual. You performed for them by day and for yourself by night. This audience never asked for more than you'd already given. Some nights, the applause sounded thinner. Other nights, you weren't sure you heard any at all. The nobles were quieter, not somber, just bored in a new way. The deaths had changed something. The feasts felt smaller. The jokes had to work harder. And you'd been there long enough that the Russias remembered your limp before you did. It started with a stumble. You'd done the trick 100 times. Leap over the wine cask, land in a somersault. You'd never missed. But tonight, your foot caught on a forgotten goblet. You crumpled sideways with a wet thud, your ankle folding underneath you. There was a pause. Then the room erupted, not in concern, but in laughter, the kind that hurts. Someone called. Was that part of the act? Another shouted, "Do it again." You tried to stand, but your leg wouldn't hold. You gave them a grin, a twitch wired deep into your face. Someone threw a bread roll. It landed trampled in the rushes. When you finally hobbled off, followed, no one helped. They just turned back to their wine and said, "He's getting old." That's the thing about being a fool. You don't get to age. You only get to slow down. And that's not the same thing. There was another new fool, younger, louder. The last one had burned bright and vanished. This one had enough edge to entertain, and enough fear to stay in line. He was faster than you ever were, louder than you could stand. The nobles loved him the way they love a new goblet, shiny, unchipped, not yet stained with old wine and worse memories. He danced through your old routines like he'd invented them, and they laughed harder than they ever had for you. When the Lord gestured toward the dais, the boy bounded up. When they said "fool," they meant him. When they said your name, if they remembered it, it was with the tone used for things that should have been replaced. Some days they forgot to summon you altogether. Other times they remembered halfway through the meal and called you up with a flick of the wrist, as if it were your fault for not anticipating their boredom. You still performed, but your jokes landed softer, your voice strained. You saw the winces before the laughter, the exchanged glances that said, "He's slipping." You felt it too, so you prepared something special, one last, brilliant routine. A biting, beautiful bit of mimicry. The steward's pompous cadence. The lady's gossip loop. The knight who confused pigs with peasants. It was risky, but elegant. You rehearsed until your throat ached and your leg trembled. You waited for the perfect moment. You delivered every line with precision and fire. It didn't land. There was silence, not the good kind, but the flat, empty kind. A few people blinked. Someone coughed. A noblewoman frowned, not offended, just confused. The new fool tilted his head as if wondering if you were doing a bit or having a fit. Then someone chuckled awkwardly, and the moment passed. Your big joke was gone. evaporated into the steam rising from a greasy roast. You bowed anyway. You had to. As you turned to limp away, a silver goblet whistled through the air and hit you square in the cheek. You heard the impact before you felt it. Then came the warmth. Your hand came away slick with red. Laughter followed. Of course, the thrower was applauded. Someone yelled, "Bullseye." Another offered to fetch a second cup. The new fool hesitated. He looked at you as if he wanted to help, but then he smiled and stepped into the gap you'd left behind. You wiped your face on your sleeve. You bowed again. You didn't remember standing up. You weren't summoned often after that. Your performances were trimmed to holidays and hangovers nights when expectations were low and the nobles just wanted noise. You learned to bow lower, grin longer, and stay out of the torchlight. Then, without warning, you were summoned during a feast. It wasn't a grand occasion, just a long, bloated banquet where the wine flowed too freely and the Lord got that bored, squinting look that usually ended with something broken. You were half asleep when the steward found you. He kicked you once. Now you limped into the hall, not bothering to straighten your bells. Your ankle hummed with a dull heat that climbed into your hip by the time you reached the dais. You bowed without flair. No one clapped. Someone called, "The old fool returns." Another added, "I thought he died." You bowed again, as if confirming both statements. Then you began. You started with something safer parody of the cook, swearing at the scullions. A light chuckle. You pivoted to the stewardin old favorite. That got more amused snorts. Permission to continue. But something shifted as you spoke. You didn't plan it. A word here, a phrase there, and suddenly the jokes stopped being about the servants and started being about the lords. Not directly, not insultingly, but the parallels sharpened. A tale of a penny-pinching steward became a commentary on a baron with tight fists and loose morals. A joke about a sermon swerved into prayers said for plague victims while grain was hoarded. They laughed harder than you'd heard in months. Faces red, mouths open, fists pounding tables as if trying to dislodge something from their ribs. You kept talking. You didn't know where the words were coming from. A well of truth dressed in silt. You talked about loyalty, what it means to serve, to kneel, to nod when your neck itches from the strain. You joked about love, how the lady looks at the knight and not her husband, and how everyone sees it except the one who matters, that there's anyone's with a grin that felt almost sincere. The Lord laughed hardest of all that should have frightened you, but you were too far in to stop. Then the room quieted, not all at once, but gradually. Someone coughed. A goblet clinked. A woman leaned forward, lips parted, as if unsure whether to applaud or cross herself. You finished softly, "But what do I know? I'm only the one allowed to say it." And then they laughed. Loud. So loud your ears rang. It didn't sound like joy or mockery. It sounded like relief, as if the court had held its breath too long and only now remembered how to exhale. The Lord stood, clapping slowly. You waited for the next Q2 bow to spin, to grovel. Nothing came. So you bowed once, deeply, arms spread, bells silent, and then you turned. You walked out with your head high, though your spine screamed and your feet dragged. No one stopped. The guards stepped aside. The dogs stayed curled in their corners, watching with glassy eyes. Outside, The night was quiet and damp. The air smelled of wood smoke and frost. As you passed beneath the archway, you realized you didn't know if that was your retirement or your execution. You only knew they had laughed, and for once you had not done. No one remembered exactly when you left. The steward found your corner, empty, and shrugged. The cook muttered about finally having quiet near the hearth. A scullery boy swore he saw you walking toward the woods at dawn, motley sleeves trailing in the mud. No one chased you. No one asked why you left or where you went. The halls carried on. New scandals replaced old ones. The new fool was younger, sharper, and more careful. His motley fit better, but it never hung with the same weight. He juggled, he rhymed. He never mentioned death or longing or politics. People said he was a delight. Somewhere beyond the castle, the world moved on. Plagues came and went. Borders shifted. The jokes you told, the ones that once made dukes spit wine, went quiet. You might have lived a long time after, or not. You might have collapsed in the woods with your bells wrapped around your wrist like a shackle. Or perhaps you became something. Elsa Farmer, a vagrant, a name muttered in a tavern story no one quite believes. It doesn't matter. The image of you survives, but only the outline, the costume, not the man. The grin, not the ache in the cheeks. The legacy is tidy, bright, harmless. Somewhere, a child tugs a jester hat over their ears and giggles into a mirror, not understanding what the bells once meant. Not knowing the motley was never a symbol of joy, just visibility. A way to be seen when nothing else about you was allowed to stand out. They sell masks, now smiling, plastic stretched in permanent cheer, sometimes with little painted tears, as if that counts as nuance. They don't tell the story of the bruised ribs, the missing teeth, the nights spent whispering jokes to a crack in the wall, just to feel like someone was listening. In museum corners, under glass, there's a stick with a faded bladder on the end. The plaque says it was used for comedic effect. It doesn't say you used it to defend yourself, or that you sometimes curled around it like a pillow when the floors were too cold. They still tell the stories. In a way, they say fools had license to speak truth to power, as if truth was ever welcome. As if your job wasn't to smuggle honesty inside a joke and pray it wasn't unwrapped too quickly. You show up in paintings never with your name, always as a background detail, bent in an impossible pose beside a throne, mouth open, mid-laugh, eyes painted wrong. No one wonders who you were. Even the word changed. Fool, once a title, now an insult. You're a meme somewhere. Your legacy boiled down to 6 words and a typo. They think you were happy. They call you the funny one. They forget the price of that title. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe that's all you were ever meant to be. A mask passed down, a grin too wide to question. You were the shape of tension, breaking the release, the echo, never the voice. But sometimes, when the firelight is just right and the wine hits wrong, and someone at the edge of a party slips into quiet, they think of you. They don't know why, just that something feels off, a laugh that came too fast, a joke that was too sharp, a story that ended without quite landing, and they hear a sound, faint and metallic, like a bell in the dirt. The cold air was a shock, a physical slap after the hall's oppressive heat. It was the first real sensation that felt entirely your own in years, not filtered through the wool of your Motley or the expectant gaze of an audience. You stood for a long moment in the muddy courtyard, the castle's hulking shadow stretching behind you like a scornful parent. From within, a final, fading wave of laughter trickled out, then was swallowed by the thick oak of the doors. They had already forgotten you. You had no plan. The concept of a destination was as foreign as the idea of a silent walk. Your life had been a series of summoned appearances. The freedom to choose a direction was terrifying. Your ankle, the old injury from your fall, throbbed in the damp cold, a familiar anchor in the disorienting quiet. The only sound was the wind sighing through the battlements and the distant, lonely hoot of an owl. You began to walk, not toward the woods, as the scullery boy would later claim, but along the well-trodden path that led to the village below the castle. It was the only path you knew. The bells on your sleeves and hat were muffled by the cloth strips you'd long ago learned to tie around them for moments like this, when you needed to move unseen through the servants' passages. Now, they gave only a faint, choked jingle with each limping step. The village was dark, shutters closed against the night and the lingering fear of plague. It smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and Paverdia scent that was somehow more honest than the castle's perfume of roasted meat and hypocrisy. You found yourself outside the tavern, the same one you'd performed in as a child, where the old idiot had drooled in the corner. A faint light bled from a crack in the shutters, driven by an impulse you didn't understand. You pushed the door open. The warmth and the smell of cheap ale and unwashed bodies hit you like a blanket. A handful of locals hunched over rough-hewn tables. They looked up, their faces wary in the guttering candlelight. Their eyes widened, not in recognition of you, but of your costume. The Motley was a beacon of the world above them. The tavern keeper, a broad man with a stained apron, frowned. "We've no need of a show," he grunted, wiping a tankard with a dirty rag. "And no coin for one, neither." You didn't speak. You simply stood there, the silence stretching. You realized you were waiting for an order, a command. Amuse us, dance. It didn't come. The expectation was a phantom limb, aching. Finally, you shook your head. You weren't here to perform. The motion was clumsy, unfamiliar. You pointed to a small, empty stool in the darkest corner. Then, to yourself, the keeper shrugged, a gesture of pure indifference that was more liberating than any applause. "Suit yourself, ale's a penny." You had no penny. You hadn't been paid in years. Your needs were met with leftover food and a drafty alcove. You shook your head again and shuffled to the corner, collapsing onto the stool. The wood was hard and unforgiving. You pulled the damp, musty wool of your jacket tighter around you, trying to make yourself small, to disappear into the shadows. The men went back to their quiet murmuring, casting occasional, suspicious glances your way. You were an anomaly, a discarded piece of court life washed up on their shore. You listened to their talk of the weather, of a sick cow, of the Lord's new taxes. Their grievances were small, immediate, and crushing. There were no clever double entendres here, no layered insults to be decoded. Their truth was bare and stark, and it needed no fool to speak it. After a time, the keeper brought over a tankard and set it down heavily in front of you. It was filled with a thin, cloudy liquid. "On the house," he muttered, not meeting your eyes. "You look like you need it more'n they do." He jerked his head toward the other patrons. You stared at the tankard. It was an act of charity. Not payment, it was for you, not the jester. The distinction was profound. Your hand trembled as you reached for it. The first sip was sour and weak, but it was the most honest thing you'd tasted in 15 years. You slept that night in the tavern's stable loft, curled in the hay beside a dozing, placid cart horse. The smell of animal and dry grass was clean, uncomplicated. For the first night in memory, no one's laughter echoed in your dreams. There was only the deep, rhythmic breathing of the horse and the skittering of mice in the rafters. The next morning, you knew you couldn't stay. You were a spectacle, a reminder of the castle they resented. You needed to shed the skin that defined you. With a grim determination, you rummaged in the stable until you found a discarded sack used for feed. It was rough and smelled of oats. In the dim light, you began the arduous task of unpicking the bells from your costume. Each bell was sewn on with thick, stubborn thread. Your fingers, more accustomed to grand gestures and the slap of a bladder stick, were clumsy and soon sore. One by one, you pulled them free, dropping them into the sack. The small brass circles stared up at you, dull and silent. When the last bell was removed, you held up the Motley. It was just a sad, patchwork suit of clothes, now garish and stained. The uniform that had been your cage was now just fabric. You buried it at the edge of the wood, digging a shallow hole with a piece of broken pottery. You shoved the sack of bells in after it, a cacophony of silence. You covered it with dark, rich soil. It felt like a funeral. You kept only the hat, not out of sentiment, but because the spring morning was cold and your head was bare. You turned your back on the village and the castle and began to walk, following the road away from everything you had ever known. You were no one. You had no name, no trade, no past that mattered. You were a blank parchment. The days blurred into a journey of hunger and anonymity. You slept in ditches, under hedges, in the lee of haystacks. You ate windfall apples, raw turnips pulled from fields, and once a handful of half-raw grains you scavenged from a miller's spillage. You learned to beg, not with a performance, but with a silent, outstretched hand. Some people shooed you away like a stray dog. Others, their own faces lined with hardship, would place a crust of bread or a wrinkled bean in your palm without a word. This quiet exchange of mercy, devoid of laughter or judgment, felt more sacred than any communion you'd ever witnessed. You passed through hamlets and crossed the lands of other lords. You saw other castles in the distance, their banners different, colors, their stones arranged in slightly different patterns, but you knew they were all the same inside. You heard snippets of news from travelers on the road, of battles won and lost, of plagues fading and returning, of a bishop excommunicating a rival. The great game went on without you. The world, you realized, was vast, and you were infinitesimally small within it. The thought was not frightening. It was a relief. One afternoon, caught in a sudden, cold downpour, you took shelter in the doorway of a small stone church. It was a humble building, not like the grand cathedrals you'd mocked. Inside, it was dark and smelled of old incense and damp stone. An old priest was kneeling at the altar, his prayers a soft, rhythmic mumble. He heard you enter and turned, his eyes kind and tired. He didn't flinch at your ragged appearance or the ridiculous, faded hat pulled low over your ears. "Come in, son," he said, his voice raspy. "The rain gives no mercy, but the house of God must." You stood awkwardly, just inside the door, dripping on the stone floor. You were waiting for the joke, for the quip about seeking sanctuary or the state of your soul. It didn't come. The priest simply rose with a grunt and fetched a rough cloth from a side room. "Here," he said, handing it to you. "Dry yourself. There's broth on the hearth." You stared at the cloth. The simplicity of his charity undid you. There was no test, no hidden meaning. He wasn't assessing your usefulness. He was just offering warmth to a cold, wet creature. You spent 3 days at that church, sleeping in a small room off the vestry. You earned your keep by chopping wood, a task your body was unaccustomed to, and your hands were soon blistered. And Ra, the priest, Father Tomas, asked no questions about your past. He spoke little, but his silence was a comfortable one, filled with the quiet rhythm of his daily chores and prayers. On the 3rd evening, as you sat by the fire, he looked at you and said, "You have the look of a man who has carried heavy things." You didn't know how to answer. You had carried nothing but a pig's bladder stick and the weight of other people's laughter. "The mind can carry burdens heavier than any stone," he continued, as if reading your thoughts. "You can leave them here, you know. Not with me, but with God, or with the fire. They do not need to be your companions any longer." That night, after he had retired, you sat alone before the dying embers of the hearth. You thought of the dead mouse on your cot, the sting of the silver goblet, the sound of your own tooth hitting the floor. You thought of the Lord's booming laugh and the bishop's stony silence. You reached into the pocket of your tattered trousers and pulled out the one thing you had kept, the wooden cup with someone else's initials, the only artifact from your life before the castle. You turned it over in your hands. It was just a cup. It held no wine, no memory, no power. You leaned forward and placed it gently into the fire. The dry old wood blackened, curled, and then caught flame, burning with a quiet orange light. You watched until it was consumed, until it was nothing but ash among the other ashes. You did not feel a grand catharsis. You felt tired and lighter. You left the next morning with Father Tomas's blessing and a small loaf of bread. The rain had cleared, and the world seemed washed clean. You continued your aimless journey, but the aimlessness now felt like peace, not paralysis. Weeks turned into months. The seasons changed. The green of late spring deepened into the full, heavy green of summer, and then began to blush with the first hints of autumn. Your body grew lean and tough from walking and scant rations. The limp in your ankle never fully left, but it became a part of you, a familiar rhythm in your step. You found work where you could. You were no farmer, but you could pull weeds. You were no carpenter, but you could carry lumber. You traded labor for food, a night in a barn, a pair of worn-out boots to replace your own, which had finally fallen apart. You spoke little. People in the countryside were accustomed to quiet, solitary men. They called you traveler or uncle, and asked no more. One evening, you came upon a traveling player's cart broken down at the side of the road. A family was gathered around Itaman, a woman, and 2 young children, their faces etched with frustration. The wheel was shattered. You stopped and watched for a moment from a distance. The man was trying to fashion a repair from a branch but it was hopeless. You approached slowly, your hands visible. You pointed to the wheel, then to yourself, and then to the woods. The man looked at you, suspicious at first, then desperate. He nodded. You spent the next hour gathering materials, using the skills of observation you'd honed in court, not to mimic, but to problem solve. You found a strong, forked branch, and, with the man's tools, managed to lash it into a makeshift support that would at least get them to the next village. You worked in silence, your hands remembering a dexterity they hadn't used in years. When it was done, the woman insisted you share their meal-thin stew of rabbit and herbs. As you ate, the man, whose name was Arlo, asked, "You're handy. You ever work with your hands before?" You shook your head. Then, after a moment, you spoke, your voice rough from disuse. "I worked with my mouth." Arlo laughed. "A big, genuine sound? A talker, eh? What did you do? Preach law?" You looked into the fire. "I told jokes." The younger child, a girl of about 6, looked up at you, her eyes wide. "You're a funny man." You met her gaze. There was no expectation there, only curiosity. "No," you said. And the truth of it was a quiet revelation. Not really. The family packed up to leave at first light. Arlo clapped you on the shoulder. "That wheel won't hold long, but it'll hold long enough. Thank you, friend." The word friend hung in the air, simple and unearned and beautiful. The woman pressed a small, carved wooden bird into your hand. "For luck," she said. You stood and watched their cart creak down the road, the patched-up wheel holding for now. You looked down at the little bird in your palm. It was clumsily made, but it had heart. You tucked it safely into your pocket, a different kind of treasure. You continued to walk, but now a purpose, faint and fragile, began to glimmer. You had helped someone. You had fixed something, however temporarily. It was a tangible thing. You started to look for other things to fix. A fence post sagging in a field. A shutter hanging from one hinge on a lonely crofter's cottage. You would make the repair quickly, quietly, and move on before anyone could come out to thank you or question you. The work was its own reward, its own silent language. You became a whisper in the countryside, a ghost of practical solutions. People began to speak of a silent, limping man who would appear out of the mist, mend a broken thing, and vanish again. Some called you a spirit. Others said you were a penitent saint. You were neither. You were just a man learning how to be useful on his own terms. One day you came to a valley you recognized, the lay of the land, the smell of the pine trees, the crooked way a particular stream cut through the heathered was familiar. You had walked in a vast, unconscious circle, and without realizing it, you were nearing the outskirts of your forgotten village, the place of your birth. A deep, primal resistance rose in you. You did not want to go back. That life was buried, both literally and figuratively. But the road seemed to pull you forward, as if the past itself had a gravity you could not escape. You crested a hill and looked down. The village was there, but it was wrong. Silent. No smoke rose from the chimneys. The fields around it were overgrown with weeds, and a grim, familiar silence hung over everything. The plague, it had swept through here like a scythe, your heart hammered against your ribs. You walked down into the village, your steps slow and heavy. Doors hung open. Through one, you could see a table still set with wooden bowls. now covered in a fine layer of dust. A child's doll lay abandoned in the mud of the street. You went to the tavern. The door was shut tight. You pushed it open. The air inside was stale and cold. The keeper was there, slumped over his bar. He was long dead, his body desiccated and peaceful in his final rest. You backed out slowly, a cold dread settling in your stomach. You walked to the small cluster of cottages at the edge of the village where you had been born. The roof of one had partially collapsed. The door to another was marked with a crude, painted crossed a sign of pestilence. You stood before the dwelling you had once, long ago, called home. The hearth where you had slept was cold and filled with ashes. You pushed the door open. It was dark inside. And then you saw her, the woman who had been your mother or your aunt. She was sitting upright in a chair by the dead fireplace, wrapped in a shawl, as if waiting for someone. Her head was bowed. You thought she was asleep or dead, but as you stepped closer, she stirred. She was ancient, withered, her face a roadmap of hardships you had only narrowly escaped. Her eyes, clouded with age and sickness, opened slowly. They focused on you, standing in the doorway, backlit by the gray afternoon light. She did not recognize you. How could she? You were a grown man, weathered and worn, a stranger. She squinted, her voice a dry rustle. "Are you the death?" she asked. There was no fear in her tone, only a weary curiosity. You shook your head. You took a step closer. "The priest, then, come to give last rites." She coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "He already came. Last week, he was the last to go." You knelt before her so she could see you better. You said nothing. Her clouded eyes scanned your face, your ragged clothes, the ridiculous, faded hat you still wore. They lingered on your eyes, and something there, some deep, buried memory, seemed to stir. "You have his eyes," she whispered. "The boy, the one who asked too many questions." A tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "They took him. The man in the green cloak said he'd be useful." She coughed again, a painful, wrenching sound. "I always wondered if he was, if he made them laugh." You reached out, your own hand rough and calloused now, and you placed it over her thin, bony one, where it rested on the arm of the chair. It was the first time you had ever intentionally touched her. She looked down at your hand, then back at your face, a slow, dawning horror mixed with the confusion in her eyes. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, it's you." You nodded just once. A profound sadness washed over her features. Not guilt, not joy at a prodigal's return, just a deep, exhausted sorrow. "Did you?" she asked again, her voice barely audible. "Did you make them laugh?" You thought of the silver goblet, the dead mouse, the bruised ribs, the sound of roaring laughter that was never for you, but for the creature you were forced to be. You thought of the feel of a wooden cup turning to ash in a fire. You leaned close so she could hear your answer, the first truth you had ever spoken to her. "Yes," you said softly. "I made them laugh." A small, shaky sigh escaped her lips. It might have been relief. It might have been regret. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes closing. Her hand went limp in yours. She was gone. You sat there on the dirt floor for a long time, holding the hand of the woman who had given you away for a bundle of old linen. You felt nothing but a vast, empty quiet. The debts of the past were beyond collecting. The accounts were closed. You buried her behind the cottage, next to the others who had no one left to mourn them. You marked the spot with a simple stone. Then you left the village of the dead and walked back into the world of the living. You did not look back. The circle was complete. The past had finally, truly, released its claim on you. You were free. You were no one. You were, for the first time, yourself. The road ahead was empty, stretching over the next hill into the unknown. You adjusted your hat, felt the small wooden bird safe in your pocket, and began to walk, your limp a steady, familiar rhythm on the hard-packed earth. The only audience now was the open sky, and it demanded nothing of you at all. The road ahead was empty, stretching over the next hill into the unknown. You adjusted your hat, felt the small wooden bird safe in your pocket, and began to walk, your limp a steady, familiar rhythm on the hard-packed earth. The only audience now was the open sky, and it demanded nothing of you at all. But the road has a way of turning back on itself, and stories are never truly over. Somewhere, in a hall of stone and shadow, a new fool adjusts his bright, untainted, motley hearing. For the first time, the chilling sound of a laughter that is not for him, but for the mask he wears. The bells are waiting. The game is eternal, and the line between a laugh and a scream is even thinner than you remember. If you wandered these grim corridors with me tonight and felt the weight of the bells, then your company has been a welcome warmth in the cold keep of history. The Medieval Grimspire Chronicles has many more tales whispered in its stone stories of knights whose honor was a lie, of maidens who were far from helpless, and of plagues that preyed on more than just the body. To ensure you never miss a story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell notification. It's the best way to know when we next descend into the past. If this tale resonated with you, give the video a like. It helps others find their way to these chronicles amidst the noise of the modern world.